No role plays, no conference calls, no BS. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader. This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris, and welcome to today's guest interview. Our guest interviews are long-form interviews with leaders from around the world. They've each been selected because of their valuable perspective on leadership and the work they've accomplished in this space. Today, we're joined by leadership coach and speaker Stephen Shedletzky. He's the author of the new book, Speak Up Culture: When Leaders Truly Listen, People Step Up. It released yesterday and is steadily climbing bestseller charts across North America. Welcome, Shed. Say hi to our audience.
Hello. Thank you, Chris. It's so good to be back with you.
We love having you back. For those who don't know, Shed was the very first guest we had on Hacking Your Leadership back in August of 2019, before either of us had ever heard the word COVID. Since then, he has started his own company and written what I believe to be the best leadership book of 2023. So the very first question I have for you, Shed, is why? What happened that made you decide to write this book, that this book had to be written?
Well, first of all, that is very, very kind, Chris, and I very much appreciate that. This book is semi-autobiographical. What's the quote that life makes sense looking backward, but it must be lived forward. So I had a few experiences in my career that sparked writing this book, and as I finished the book and I wrote the last chapter called It's Personal, because I believe all great leadership is personal. There's sort of 2 fundamental things that happened in my life that created this book. One is I grew up with a stutter. So I know what it feels like to be voiceless. I know what it feels like to have something to say, but to choose not to, or to attempt to speak up, but it doesn't happen or go well at all. I later married a speech therapist. Good choice on my part, not just for me, but more so for my kids and nieces and nephews. So that's one, a really formative part of my life is having a stutter. The other is, in my 15 plus year career, I've had experiences on teams where there's a speak up culture, where people can share openly their ideas, their feedback, their concerns, their disagreements, even admit mistake. And all of those inputs lead to better results and better outcomes. And those teams are marvelous. Not only are the organizations and teams more resilient and innovative, the health of the organization and the relationships that you have amongst people are fantastic. And I've also been parts of teams that don't have a speak up culture, or it's a selective speak up culture. You have to be very careful about what you say and to whom. And it more represents, watch what you say culture, or a zip it or a shut it culture. And not only are those bad for business, it's bad for the health and well-being of the people who are in it.
I would imagine that these 2 types of cultures are only distinguishable in contrast to each other. And so was this the kind of thing where you started out at an organization without one and you didn't realize that there was, oh, wait a minute, there's something else here because you had joined another one that did have one? Or did you start out with one that did have it and thought this must be the way the world works? And then you unfortunately had to go to another one where it didn't have one and go, wait a minute, I'm never going back to this. Like, how did that evolution happen for you?
Well, it's both, because there's speak up culture. Like I make the analogy in the book of cultures like pickle brine. So you can put a world-class cucumber in some awful pickle brine, and we, my friends, have an awful pickle that should never have been made. And we can't blame the cucumber. We have to examine the brine. And so, we can label some cultures as being a speak up culture or not a speak up culture. And so much of that has to do with the behaviors of the leaders. But there can always be pockets. There can be speak up relationships. So my first job ever out of college was at a rotational leadership development program, a big company. And when I had been hired out of college, a few months later, a merger happened. And then literally on my first day on the job, 1,000 people were let go post-merger, citing, post-merger synergies. I'm using air quotes there.
Of course.
And so that was my introduction to the corporate world. I was walking in as a young 20-something-year-old kid, as many more people were walking out, boxes in hand. And so I saw the direct impact of uncertainty, lack of transparency from leaders, not toxic intent, but there being a culture that wasn't as healthy as I think it could have been. I remember I had a colleague who was a 37-year-old veteran of the company who was in the cubicle next to me, and she was scared that her pink slip was going to arrive next. And not only did it impact her work productivity, it impacted her health and well-being. And I saw this all around me. So would I define that culture as a speak up culture? No, but I definitely had some one-to-one relationships with folks where we absolutely had a speak up culture. And it wasn't just venting, it was actually healthy and productive. Sometimes it was venting, but it was healthy and productive. And yeah, I've seen, I think it's a really astute point, Chris, that, sometimes you can't know one without the other. So I have seen, experienced, studied, the full range and spectrum of these, and there's still more that I'm learning about, because this is a constant education for me as well. But yes, I've seen organizations transform from not having a speak up culture to having a speak up culture, and vice versa.
When I saw your book, the first thing I thought of was, I follow Amy Edmondson on LinkedIn, and then more recently Timothy Clark, two names of people who have really devoted a lot of their energy and practice to the term psychological safety, which I heard for the first time maybe a decade ago. Now it's kind of ubiquitous. You hear it all over the place. When I saw your book, the first thing I thought was, this is great. This is like the whole Eli 5, explain like I'm 5, psychological safety. And because
I had to write it at a level that I could understand. So
which is amazing, because that's what I thought what I was getting into was, this is psychological safety for people who don't want to be taught by a PhD. They want to be taught by someone who maybe has been in the trenches with them and who has seen a lot of this work kind of play out. But it was more than that. It wasn't just psychological safety. Because you go into something about the idea of it being worth it speaking up, and I think that's the part that psychological safety is missing. It can be as safe as you want it to be, but I think in a lot of organizations, people think, what's the point? Why should I speak up? Nothing's going to change.
Yeah. So so much to comment here. Let's see if I can organize my thoughts in the best way possible. So. I first learned the term psychological safety from reading Adam Grant's book, Give and Take, in which there's a little subtext where he references psychological safety and Edmondson's well-known hospital study, where she studied two sort of sets of hospital room environments, one where there is psychological safety and one where there isn't. And she found that there were more medical errors reported where there is psychological safety. The key word is reported. Not more medical errors reported, which means that inside of hospital room environments where people feel that there's psychological safety, which as Edmondson defines is an environment in which people feel safe taking interpersonal risk. Health practitioners could raise their hand and say, I made a mistake. And the result was, let's learn from it, not you're fired or you're punished. So that was when Edmondson really put psychological safety on the map, which was in the late 90s. Project Aristotle came out from Google. I think that was 2004, which highlights that the number one determinant of team performance is psychological safety. Two other names that I'll throw in there, if you haven't come across their work, I would highly recommend it, is Minette Norman and Caroline Helbig. They wrote the Psychological Safety Playbook. They actually met in one of Edmondson's trainings from the Fearless organization, and they said, this topic is fantastic, but it's so misunderstood. Everything right now is all academic, and I need something practical. And so they wrote a practical field guide inclusive of 25 moves that leaders and managers can take to create more psychological safety, which is fantastic. So I'll fully admit, Chris, that when I started writing this book, I'm a big fan of Amy, both her work and her as a person. She's delightful. She endorsed the book. She's fantastic. And I have a bit of beef with the term psychological safety. My beef is I feel as though we put a sort of white vanilla lab coat on top of a very human experience. And most of the work up to this point has been academic. And so I fully admit that when I first started writing this book, I thought I was just rebranding psychological safety. A good old Zig Ziglar quote, people don't buy drills, they buy holes.
Mm.
If the drill is psychological safety, what you get as a result, the hole, is a speak up culture. But as I delved into the topic and I researched the topic more, I began to form a thesis that is fortunately backed with research and scientific research on this, that to create a speak up culture, it's a 2x2 matrix, as you mentioned, of is it safe? Is it psychologically safe? And is it worth it? Because sometimes it's psychologically safe, but it may not be worth it. By worth it, I mean, do you feel it will cause any positive change? Or when you do speak up, does anything different happen? Do you feel heard? Is there a substantial change in organizational policy or how leaders or the people around you behave? Or is it just words and no action? And so it might feel safe to say to a friend, I think you should stop having 4 alcoholic beverages every night, but you don't necessarily think it's going to lead to any meaningful change in their behavior. And how many interventions are you going to make there? How many times are you going to go back to that dry or maybe wet well, right? Mm-hmm. But also challenges with bureaucracy, systemic issues, right? You might feel safe to speak up, but if it doesn't lead to any meaningful impact, you might get apathy setting in. Obviously, you want it to be both safe and worth it. But if it isn't safe, but it is worth it. This is really interesting to me as well, because it's not psychologically safe, but you feel so connected to the stakes that you are unwilling to remain silent. And this is where the courageous few will still speak up to their own detriment, to risking their own reputation, their own jobs, their own relationships. We saw this from Ed Pearson at Boeing, who I feature prominently in the book. He was the senior manager and engineer on the floor at the Boeing Renton facility where they made the 737 MAX, still make the 737 MAX. And he spoke up repeatedly and ended up whistleblowing in US Congress saying that this plane is not safe. We saw this with Kimberly Young McClear as well in the US Coast Guard as a Black, openly gay female PhD and a senior leader. She spoke up about a culture of harassment there, which continues to come out in the news recently. So I really admire folks that despite personal risk, it not feeling safe, they still are a salmon swimming upstream and choose to speak up. And then, of course, we don't want to be in cultures where it's neither safe nor worth it. And I've been there. That's an unhappy marriage between fear and apathy.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to the study that Edmondson did in the hospital, and it seems like because of the environment chosen, a lot of those decisions are life and death decisions. And so in those situations, there could be a lot of situations where people thought it was not safe to speak up, but worth it to speak up because someone's life may have been on the line, and that maybe that data set, while good, because it doesn't take into account the fact that medical errors you typically can lead to somebody dying or having major health problems. Maybe some of the people who spoke up were speaking up even though they didn't think it was safe, but they thought it was worth it. And in a lot of organizations, we always hear the term, we're not curing cancer here, right? Like there are a lot of people say that about the work that they do, and it's true from a standpoint of not taking your work, not taking yourself too seriously when it comes to your job. But that means that in a lot of organizations, it may not be worth it. No one's life is on the line, so why speak up?
So here's the point, though. In lines of work where there's life and death, we're talking healthcare, military, law enforcement, aerospace, or making the Titans submersible. That's a documented speak up culture issue as well. There was a director of safety who spoke up and said this is not a safe vessel, and he was fired. Right.
Yep.
Now, the point that I make is that though it isn't as quickly life and death, we know from UKG and the National Institute of Health that our relationship with our boss has more of an impact on our health than that of our relationship with our family doctor or our therapist if we have one. And the impact of our relationship with our boss is at par with the impact of our relationship with our life partner as it relates to our health and well-being. And so while we can say we're not curing cancer, here's the thing. Shitty leadership causes cancer. It's a slower burn. but it causes cancer. We've seen increased incidence of heart disease and cancer. Toxic cultures are breeding environments in which people are suffering in the long term and short term, both emotionally and physically, because our relationship with the people around us at work and beyond matters a lot. And so for anyone who says we're not in a life and death industry, leadership in and of itself, regardless of what industry you're in, is a life feeding or life depleting line of work. The stakes can't be higher.
I think I love that. We recently had Jim Harter on the show, the chief scientist at Gallup, and his organization, I think, was the one that first said that the relationship with your boss matters more than the relationship with even your doctor. Knowing that, and that employee engagement is currently at a 7-year low, one could interpret from that if you're not engaged, you know, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's apathy, right? So if you are apathetic about your job, if your engagement is low, does that mean that the impact is less? Does that mean that it doesn't matter to me what my boss does because I've kind of written it off? I'm here to get my job done and then leave. I'm not emotionally bought in anymore. You know, can that be interpreted that way, or does low engagement not mean lower impact from the boss to the employee relationship?
I'm not sure we can make a definitive judgment or just call on that. I think there's a few things happening. I mean, one, low engagement could be that your relationship with your boss and the organization isn't good, and there's an impact on your health. I also think there's a bit of a awakening through COVID. You know, I'm from Toronto and I live on the East Coast, and I think that so often people on the East Coast, our identities are tied to our work. Whereas on the West Coast, Vancouver, BC, San Fran, I often feel, Portland, I often feel that people define themselves by their hobbies and their activities, which I love. You know, it's like, what do you do? I'm an investment banker. Oh, you must be from New York. What do you do? I really like surfing. Oh, you must be from the West Coast. I think there's been a shift and sort of a great awakening to the fact that our entire lives aren't our work. And in fact, if you find that your identity is really tied predominantly to your work, it's your relationship with your work and your relationships in general probably aren't as strong as they could be. And so I don't wish low engagement upon anyone. I think someone can have a healthy relationship with the fact that I have a job. It isn't my entire identity. I have, harmony or integration with my work and my life. I don't like calling it balance because balance denotes a scale of competition. It's not work-life balance. It's work-life harmony or work-life integration. But even someone who has a healthy relationship with their work, and you can love your work and have a big part of your identity tied to it and still be highly engaged and have a healthy relationship with it, but it's a holistic life. So I don't think low engagement is good for anyone. And I think people can clock in, clock out and still be highly engaged. I think anytime someone is low engagement, there's friction and tension that is getting in the way of them showing up at their best, giving any discretionary effort. And I think that so much of it is we have more and more people exiting the workforce, more and more people for the first time ever in first-time leadership roles. And there's a trifecta of chapters in the book, as you know, that I sort of liken to 3 Beatles tracks, squished into one, this 12-minute amazing Beatles track of define leadership, select better leaders, and help leaders lead. I think we need to define what does it mean to lead in general, but also in this particular organization. And then do you actually select and promote people who aren't just top performers, but also behave in a way that's aligned with the stated organizational values and behaviors? And then do we actually help our leaders lead? There's no training like on-the-job training, but we need to help our leaders lead, regardless if they're in a formal role of leadership yet, or if they just want to lead.
I love that point, and it kind of makes me think of the fact that over the last for the last 10 years, but really focusing on the last 3 years, the ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations have become much more in the forefront of what we talk about. I've been in organizations and I've consulted with organizations where you would think by sitting in a group of people that there was a speak up culture, that there was a great relationship between everybody there. No one was afraid to speak up. Things that people said were acknowledged and it was worth it. But the right people weren't always at the table. So so the things that should have been brought up weren't brought up, not because someone was afraid to, but because no one saw it. No one in the room saw that something had to be brought up. That could be one of many reasons why even in a speak up culture, the right actions aren't had. How do you test for a speak up culture if it just seems like all the boxes are checked? Like everybody feels comfortable, it's safe, it's worth it, but the wrong decisions are still being made. How is that tested?
Well, I think that's a great point. So a couple things here is, if you don't have a diverse group of folks who feel that it's safe and worth it to speak up, you might be making decisions in a vacuum that aren't the right decision or aren't the most informed decision. So I think it's, obviously at a senior leadership table, it's of benefit to have a diverse group of folks. And this is also around the more senior you get in an organization, regardless of your gender or how you look or where you come from or anything, there's a hierarchical truth because we're a hierarchical species. The more senior you get in an organization, the further away you can get from the truth. Why? Because we're hardwired to offer you deference, right?
Yes.
And I've seen this in startups. I have a buddy who's a CEO of a now scale up, and he's a marginalized individual himself. He's brown. And when it was him and his two buddies, it was just him. It was Ankur, right? But now he leads an organization with 450 people. And when he walks into the room, he's not Ankur. He's the CEO and founder. And we could talk smack about him behind his back, but as soon as he walks in the room, everyone buttons up and stands up straight and treats him or senior leaders with respect. Why? Because we're biologically wired to. He has authority. He has positional power and influence, which means leaders have to work especially hard to seek truth from as diverse of a group as possible. And part of diversity is seniority, right? Go to folks more junior. Hey, we want to make this decision on the spreadsheet and in the boardroom. It makes sense, but what's the impact of this decision for you? Do you see a better way? And then zip it and listen. And if who you're asking says something you don't like to hear, don't punish them for saying something you don't like to hear that doesn't prove your hypothesis. Dig in, say thank you, because one of the best ways to create a culture of silence is to repeatedly ignore people when they speak up, or worse, punish them when they do, especially when they share hard things. And a speak up culture isn't about fearlessness. There's no such thing as fearless. In fact, if you come across a fearless leader, that's the leader who's going to get you killed or get you in trouble. Fear is important. So when anyone says, here's our fearless leader, no such thing, right? Here's our leader who feels the fear and presses on anyway. The goal of leaders is not to be fearless, but to create less fear. Because speaking up, leading, it isn't without risk. It isn't without fear. It's about using fear as data to help you navigate and move through. Fear is a risk modulator. If it weren't for fear, we wouldn't have courage.
If I'm a leader and I'm trying to create this kind of culture in my organization, is there anything I can do besides, making sure that I shine a spotlight on the people who do make an attempt to challenge it? Like, is there a way to grow this inorganically? Do I have to just sit there and wait for someone to speak up and acknowledge them? Or can I do something in advance to help maybe those interactions happen?
The two actions I've learned that create a speak up culture, it's a virtuous cycle between encourage and reward. So if you want a speak up culture, even if you're in an organization that doesn't have one right now, or you're in a cultural context, like if the specific region that you're in or country you're in doesn't really have a speak up culture. We see this in many Asian cultures where you do not challenge authority. right? Now you can create a new organizational cultural norm based on the behaviors of the folks who work there, especially senior leaders. Because as a leader, a whisper is a shout and your tiptoes are stomps. The behaviors, that the individual values and behaviors of leaders have a disproportionate impact on the type of culture that you have. And so if leaders want a speak up culture, first and foremost, they got to let people know, hey, we value your voice. We want to hear what you have to say, especially if it's dissenting or isn't in line with our conclusion, right? You do everything that you can. You ask questions, you hold for silence, you have a suggestion box or an anonymous hotline or a call-in, right? If given the choice between no feedback and anonymous feedback, I'd still like anonymous feedback, right? Now, there's one better, which is people putting their name next to it, written or spoken. But not every organization is at that place where they can do that. So I'd rather anonymous than nothing. But leaders encourage, and encourage could look like we're on a Zoom meeting and I just made a presentation and I could say to the team, hey, team, I'm really working on clearly communicating in as concise way as I can, because sometimes I can ramble. On a scale of 0 to 10, please drop in the chat. And if you prefer it to be anonymous, send it via anonymous chat to, this person or this format. On a scale of 0 to 10, how clear was that? 10 meaning clear as crystal, 0 meaning I don't understand a single word that you're saying. If everyone says 10, I think you're lying, right? And then again, on my concise, could I have said it quicker or better? Like poll, ask, use breakout rooms, like encourage, create this culture where voice is welcome. And then as soon as people do speak up, which could be an idea, which could be feedback, which could be a concern, even if it's personal or unpopular, it could be disagreement, especially with a senior leader, it could be admitting mistake, all these things. Do you reward that behavior? In our cultures, we get the behavior that we reward and we get the behavior that we tolerate. Tolerating behavior is a passive way of rewarding it. So if someone's a great performer, but they're a total jerk, do you tolerate it because their numbers are great? Well, that we know that that's detrimental to the overall health and results of the team. You actually have to provide that person with feedback and coaching and discipline if necessary, or offer them to the competition and let them wreak havoc over there, right? So encourage and then reward. Reward doesn't mean a raise, a bonus, a promotion, or making a statue of someone and putting it out front of the corporate headquarters or, putting into your metaverse or whatever. Reward means thank you. Please tell me more. I don't fully see what you're saying yet, but I think you're onto something. I really appreciate the courage that it just took to share that different point of view, And sometimes folks will speak up, but it isn't done in the most emotionally intelligent or situationally aware, way. And you can still say, thank you for sharing your truth and your opinion. I think there's, you can still coach around the right time, the right place, the right method, but you can't silence, you can't shut it. Then you're not rewarding it and you won't close that cycle. I think it's the comedian Craig Ferguson who's quoted with the most beautiful Venn diagram of speaking up. And it's, does it need to be said by me and now? And I think that's a really great guide. And if you have a truly healthy speak up culture, if it needs to be said now, but not by you, it's still fine for me to go, hey, Chris, I hate to put you on the spot. But I know that there's a perspective that you hold around this that will fundamentally change the dynamic of this conversation and the result that we're going to have here, the decision that we're going to make. At risk of putting you on the spot, can you share that appendix 3 with, we really need to have that conversation now, and that's rewarded, right? And the last thing I'll say on this is it ripples. So let's say I report to you, I build up the courage to step into the speak up boxing ring and the spotlight's on me and my heart's beating. And I say the thing to you, I share the idea, I give feedback, I share a concern, I disagree, I admit mistake, whatever it might be. Based on how that goes, ripples. If it doesn't go well, guess what? I'm deflated and I tell my friends. If it does go well, guess what? I feel valued and I tell my friends. And so it's a virtuous cycle and it ripples. because that's how culture sets that tone. That if leaders encourage and reward people for speaking up, you're more likely to have a speak up culture.
I think you're right on that, and I think whenever a leader is attempting to change something, so if I'm a new leader and I'm taking over a team and there is not a speak up culture on this team, or if they're just not used to it, as soon as I start putting these things into place, there will be people on the team who will derail it for their own benefit. They'll use it incorrectly, so to speak. How do you prevent it from being derailed by those people without giving the impression to the others that you don't really mean what you say, that you're shutting it down, because they might not know the difference in the moment?
I think a couple of things. I mean, one, the most brilliant case study on this is the case study of Alan Mulally when he took over at Ford Motor Company. So Mulally was leading Boeing commercial, was very much credited to the resurgence of Boeing commercial in the late 90s, early 2000s. He moves over to Ford Motor Company that was struggling at the time. Product wasn't good. Financials were awful. Wasn't a good culture. Was more of a culture of tyranny than a really healthy speak up culture. Mulally takes over in his opening press conference. He's asked what car he drives, and he says a Lexus because it's the best car on the road, as if to form a rallying cry to the people who worked at Ford, make me a car I actually want to drive, right? And Mulally did as all of us would do. He had his direct reports. He would do weekly status meetings. Where are you at? What do you need? Simple sort of green, yellow, red. And for the first number of weeks, everything was green. Like everything was just hunky-dory. And, after this charade happened for some time, I don't know how long, I think weeks, Mulally finally said, I'm not sure if you're all paying attention, but we're bleeding money and we're about to go bankrupt. So either you're lying to me or your people are lying to you. If we're actually going to right this ship and save this company, we need to embrace more truth-telling, right? And one guy, Mark Fields, raises his hand and says, I got an issue here. And Mulally literally stood up, gave him a standing ovation, said, thank you, Mark. That's a reward. Who can help Mark? Establishing a new precedent. Someone raised their hand. I can help him, right? Great. The next week at the next meeting, Mulally unofficially promoted Mark by having him sit next to him at the boardroom table to denote more of that, right? And it was that type of behavior that turned it around from a culture that was previously one that was more akin to sitting at a table with Dr. Evil. If you brought bad news, you just weren't at the next meeting. You were the problem, not healthy. And so Mulally set a new precedent. Mark Fields actually became the next CEO succeeding Mulally. Mark Fields did. And Ford was the only major American car manufacturer that didn't require a government bailout in 2008. So that's a great example of a leader who can turn it around. Now, to your question of what happens when people are like, ooh, I can get ahead here by posturing and speaking up and doing this thing. First and foremost, there's a difference between speaking up and sucking up. And I think leaders need to be aware of that. There's also really toxic behavior of certain people or folks or leaders peacocking, where they kiss up, but they're awful to work with peer to peer and awful to work for from a direct report, work up. And so what leaders need to do is know that their point of view is just but one point of view. And this is where 360 feedback or talking to a skip level or, getting a sense of not just because, oh, well, Chris is lovely to me, ergo Chris is lovely to everyone, I'm going to promote Chris. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, why do they promote Chris, right? So I think we can't, as leaders, we cannot only trust upon our own experience and our own instinct. We need to get a more holistic 360 view, of which there are tools for that. And we can ask, and we can get a more holistic experience than just our one-to-one experience, where people, again, biologically kiss up because we're biologically wired to offer deference to those who have authority over us.
I love how the book in general is a compilation of stories. Like there's learnings and there's teachings in there, but it seems like they all kind of are rooted in a story. It starts with a story. It's one of the reasons why I think it's so compelling, and why I just wanted to keep reading it as I went along. One of the stories that jumps out at me is the story about your sister applying to be to be a physician, to be get into medical school, and how they asked her to tell them something that she was passionate about, to teach them something she was passionate about, as a way of discerning what type of a person she was, what type of leader she was. So first thing, I'm going to start using that example in my own interviews that I do with people, because I think it's one of those things you truly know somebody's colors when you ask them, when you put them in a place where they might be more comfortable, and so they're thinking less about what type of facade they're trying to put onto you, and they're just kind of allowed to be in their own space. Somebody once said to me, "You see a person's true colors by waking them up at 3:00 in the morning." Like that's how you know whether they're a nice person in general or not.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's so effective at discerning someone's ability to be a leader of people, or to foster that culture that they're looking for?
So I lean into the work of Rich Davini. Rich is a very close friend. He's a retired U.S. Navy SEAL, led an elite SEAL team, and he began selecting and promoting folks to join his particular elite team, not solely based upon skills. Because there's a dream team paradox. Look at what was the U.S. Olympic basketball team in whatever year it was, where they literally had a world all-star team, like
92.
Every 92
Barcelona. Yeah.
So I mean 92. Who was on that then? Probably Malone and
Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan,
Patrick Ewing, probably.
Yep.
Right. And it didn't work because every single position, they were the guy on their team. And so when you have one shot to make, every single guy on the floor is like, "That's my ball." And it's like, no, right? So that's a dream team paradox. And so often we approach hiring on our teams of, the best graphic designer, the best project manager, the best, but we only look at skills, which is only at most half of the equation. What Davini really dives into are, what are the human attributes? What are their characteristics? Do they gel well? What do we need from these people? Not from a skill. Skill, we aren't born with skills. We learn them: typing, talking, riding a bike. But when you're teaching your kid how to ride a bike, which is a skill, and they fall off inevitably and scrape their knee, now their true colors are showing. Do they persevere? Do they give up? Do they shrink? Do they fold? Do they keep pressing on? And it's not right or wrong. It just is, right? And so we all sort of innately are born with, though we aren't destined, we can develop things, but we're born with levels of empathy, compassion, resilience, adaptability. Like, human beings as a species are adaptable, but some of us are more adaptable than others, right? When I throw a change at someone, if someone's a 10 out of 10 on adaptability, or an 8 or a 9, they go with the flow, they make it work. Someone who's a 1 or 2 or 3, still adaptable, just takes a lot more energy. It's harder for them, but still adaptable. And so I love Rich's work, and I think it's some of the best work out there when it comes to hiring and building a team, because you look at not just skills, but attributes. So, I mean, one of the famous stories from the SEALs, to be a good SEAL, one of the skills is to be a good swimmer. And so one of the first things they do is you hop into the pool in Coronado Beach, and you swim. It's called pool comp. They just see, what's your competency as a swimmer. One sailor, apparently in the early 90s, probably around the time of the dream team at basketball team, hops into the pool, sinks to the bottom like a stone, walks across the bottom of the pool, touches the other end, gasps for air, comes back, right? Everyone's watching this sailor like, what the hell is this guy doing? They yank him out of the pool. The instructor, when the guy comes back to after he nearly drowned, says, "What were you doing?" To which the young sailor says, "Sir, I don't know how to swim." To which the instructor says, "We can teach you how to swim." That young sailor didn't have the skill of swimming, but given 2-3 weeks, they could catch up, right? They displayed the appropriate attributes to become a SEAL, which is perseverance, courage, cunning, stupidity, whatever it might be. Like, he had it, right? And that instructor said potential, right? Skills measure what is performance, whereas attributes measure potential, what could be. So I'll take you to my sister now. When my sister was interviewing to get into a particular medical school, McMaster University, just down the street from Toronto in Hamilton, Ontario, it's a school that prides itself on helping to train and develop great family physicians. What does a great family physician need? Well, a great family physician has a ton of stuff from newborn to geriatrics. Like, they have everything. And so they need to think on their feet. They need to adapt. They need to have a ton of knowledge. They need to have the humility to know when to refer out. Like, there's a certain makeup of what makes a great family physician: bedside manner, ability to communicate hard things in clear ways. And so how do you test for that? Like, how do you figure out if someone has good bedside manner? Well, you have to put them in a situation where they display it, right? And the best way to do that and see their true colors, as you said, is to expose them to stress, uncertainty, and challenge. My sister never prepared in her med school preparations, of which there are many med school preparations interviewing. She never prepared for this question. And the question was, teach us something that you're passionate about. To which she went, okay. She loves dance. She asked them to stand up. She said, I love to dance. I'm going to teach you the first moves that I learned when I was a little girl, when I learned ballet. And she taught them first position and second position and this and that. They weren't measuring her performance as a teacher and her ability to help them learn to dance. They were awful dancers. What they were examining was, how does she react when something new comes at her that she wasn't expecting? Does she get flustered? Does she get pissed? Is she like, what does this have to do with anything? I'm not doing it. Or is she like, all right, let's have some fun. I'm going to teach you how to dance, right? And she displayed well the attributes that they were looking for: patience, ability to communicate complex things in clear ways, bedside manner, list goes on. So for anyone listening, I think that the value is, beyond skills, what are the attributes required for people to thrive and add to the team, to the organization, and the particular role? I've heard nightmare stories where hiring managers say, I want to hire that person because they're charismatic and I like them. And the HR business partner is like, does the role require charisma? No. It's like, well, then what does it matter? Look to what the role requires and hire for that, and get really good at examining how that person is as it relates to those human characteristics and attributes.
I love that. There's a study that was done, and I'm kind of brain farting on the name of whoever did this, where a group of people were asked to throw out as many skills as possible and then as many attributes as possible. And the idea of, who would you rather hire? Every single person went for someone with the attributes over the skills, because all the skills can be taught. You give me a person who has the attributes of a good learner, someone who's open, someone, all the attributes, and that person can learn anything. But someone with all the skills in the world who's just not a nice person, who doesn't like people, who isn't a pleasure to be around, that person will derail a team. And it's so profound to see it in action. And this is exactly what this is talking about. The most impressive part about the story with your sister, and I'll assume this happened in exactly the way it was in the book, and there wasn't another line in there that was cut out from the interview, is that she went right to the dance part over something that was medical related. And so when I first, 15, 20 years ago, when I first took over a team, I would sit down with each person and I would say, tell me about yourself. I want to know about you. And they would always, almost always, start talking about who they were in relation to the business, what they did for the company, this and and I had to stop them and say, no, not that. Tell me about you. And they would look at me like kind of deer in headlights, like, what do you mean? Tell me about me. And that kind of starts off the relationship on a good foot if you kind of get to know each other. I'm impressed your sister didn't start talking about something medically that she was passionate about, that she went right to dance. That part's phenomenal to me.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm sure there were folks who did, and that's okay. But yeah, I love what she did.
Yeah, no, it's phenomenal. And you're right. That's when you see a person's true colors. If I'm a leader and I am trying to create a speak up culture on a team, and it's not that there isn't one, there's the opposite of one, right? I'm going onto a team and it's clear very quickly that, oh my gosh, there's some problems here. Yeah. Where do I need to start? What's the low-hanging fruit that I can do to kind of start the team off on the right foot, knowing that when a dog has been beaten for 2 years straight, it's not going to cuddle up to you on the couch right away. It needs several months.
Yeah. So I think two things. I mean, one, what can you do as a leader today if you're listening and you're like, oh, maybe I wasn't doing as well as I thought I was, or I want to do better. Or you're stepping into a role in which the previous leadership and culture wasn't to speak up culture and was more toxic. I think, first and foremost, listen and get an understanding of what is and what was. The first thing I do whenever I speak with a client is give me the context. Like, sure, I'm bringing content, but content without context is meaningless. So give me the context. I think leaders can do the same. Hey, what am I stepping into? What's the environment? What's the context? Find a few trusted folks who are willing to share some truth or give you something. If you're not getting anything, it's, hey team, this is how I'm trying to lead here. Throw me a bone, But I think for leaders, regardless of the environment you're in, I think you need to label some truth. And I think A, if you know that you've made missteps as a leader, tell the team. B, if you want to learn as a leader your impact, ask for it and listen. And then in that third scenario, if you're walking into an environment in which you're taking over for a less than stellar leader, call a spade and say, hey, I know I'm walking into an environment in which previously you weren't celebrated or rewarded for sharing your ideas. In fact, you were punished, you were demeaned. Like, I'm not trying to make them wrong, but I'm trying to say what I think I'm walking into. And I understand that. And this is the way that I wish to lead. I'm not going to get it right all the time, but I'm striving to lead this way. And you set a new precedent, and you pull an Alan Mullally and you say, if we want to feel engaged, if we want to succeed, if we want to enjoy showing up to work, it's going to take some behaviors. I'm going to strive to live them. I expect you to live them. If you're not living them, I expect us to give feedback to each other so that we do live them. And for those who don't want to come aboard, they don't have to, and they can choose to go work somewhere else, or it can just be awful for a period of time. But in our cultures, we get the behavior we reward, and we get the behavior that we punish. So tell the team, these are the behaviors that we're looking for. Behave them, because there's nothing worse than saying these are the behaviors and then you don't. Tell the team you want feedback on your behavior, and then you can create a change one brick at a time.
I was having a conversation with an employee who had just had the opportunity to go to a corporate event, and there was a moment when they were speaking to the kind of the number 2 person in the organization. And it was in a room full of people. There were probably 1,000 people in the room milling about, and they walked up and wanted to kind of shake hands and meet this person. And they said that the conversation lasted only about a minute and a half. But for that minute and a half, it felt like time had stopped, that person that they were talking to was listening to them in a way that wasn't just they were, there for the photo op and shaking the hands and moving on to the next person, because there were a lot of other people who wanted to meet that person too and shake hands. That they felt like they were the only one in the room, for that minute and a half. And it was just listening to them tell me that story, it was a profound moment. And I started thinking to myself, do I do that? Like, I want to be that kind of person who makes time stop for others when they are talking to me. In the title of the book, the word truly is in there. Leaders who truly listen. What's the difference between a leader who listens and a leader who truly listens? There's this element that just makes people feel like, oh my gosh, I'm important to this person, even if for just one moment here.
Yeah. And I think it sets a good precedent of this is how leaders behave here in this organization, which I love. A couple things come to mind here. One is the difference between a finished conversation and a complete conversation. Another thought here is you don't get to claim that you're a great listener, that you're present. Like if I say I'm really present for other people, like BS, like, come on. It's valuable if you say, wow, Shed is really present. Shed made me feel heard. That bears weight. I can't label myself a good leader. I can't label myself a good friend. I must behave in a way that earns others calling me that. I was really passionate about including the word truly in the subtitle of the book because listening is a skill. There are people who are skilled listeners, but if you combine listening with compassion and empathy, it's a leadership superpower. Listening on its own can be used as an atom bomb to manipulate. You can be a really good listener, get what you want to hear, and then use it against people. You're still a good listener, but with malintent. Mm-hmm. And so for me, truly, it encompasses leaders who listen with an intent to serve, with compassion, with empathy, with confidentiality when it's appropriate, right? So that's why I feel truly is important. And it mixes the skill of listening with the attributes of compassion. The other thing that I would say, when possible, is for leaders to track the difference, for any of us to track the difference between finished conversations and complete conversations. A finished conversation is one because we're running to the next meeting, or we got our kids to pick up from school or carpool or whatever, that we literally finish a conversation because of finite time. And those among us who are great communicators and great leaders will say, I'm aware this is a finished conversation and there's more that we need to do to complete on it. I've got to run. Can we complete on this? How's tomorrow morning or Friday afternoon or whatever, and then do it. And I make the distinction, there's capital L leader and lowercase l leader. Capital L leader means you have the title, but you may not lead. Lowercase l leader means you may or may not have the title, but you lead. The only requisite of leadership is followers, people who trust you, trust that you have their best interests at heart and mind, and follow your vision if you have one. You don't have to have vision to be a leader, but most importantly, you behave as a leader. Compassion, empathy, decisiveness, ownership, accountability, authenticity. Like, these are the things that we look for in actual leaders, whether uppercase L or lowercase l. So just a few things there. And I think for leaders to track finished conversations and complete on them, your effectiveness as a communicator will skyrocket.
I love that answer, and I've loved our time today, Shed. Thank you so much for being here. Give our audience an ask. It's your book launched yesterday. Where we'll include a link to it in the podcast description. So go ahead and click on that. Where would you like them to go to buy it? Where does it help you?
Thank you so much, Chris. That's so kind. If this conversation was valuable, please share it with a friend or a colleague. Hop on over to speakupculture.com. We have a free chapter giveaway there. So if you want to check out the first couple chapters of the book, you can give us your email address and we'll send you that. And order the book. If you like what you hear, go to a local retail shop and support indie bookstores, or hop online wherever you like to or don't like to buy your books, but you do it anyway. It's there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Shed. I really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure to join you again, Chris, and hope this has been a good conversation for your audience.